memories about Haiti, because you went back there a number of times. I gather summers, and you had a family there, probably still do. So I'm curious about your affinity with the land in Haiti and what that might have to do with some of your interests in terms of land here. That's a fair question to begin with.
So thank everyone for coming. I was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and my parents brought me here to the United States, to the Washington, D.C. area. I was about 3 months old or so. But every summer we would go back, myself, my brothers, and we'd go meet up with our cousins and spend summers in Haiti. And we had a blast. I think even then we recognized the difference in the pace of things between Haiti and the United States. Things move slower, and so people got a greater chance to talk. And I think that really, I spent many years where I didn't go back to Haiti, but then I went back several years ago, and we had some friends coming over to visit us, 2 sisters who were coming from really out of town, so the drive was almost an hour up. And they came, and we ended up getting stuck somewhere, so we spent all kinds of time stuck, and we knew they were at the house waiting for us. And so we rushed back, or we had them sitting there for about an hour, and when we came in, they were sitting in the living room, chatting and and I came in, I was very apologetic. And they said, no big deal, we're just sitting here talking, and they live in the same house, and so I'm like, you know, you guys talk at home all the time, you're in a car together for an hour, they're talking, and now they come to someone's house, instead of being upset that you're not there waiting for them, they were just talking. And that, to me, is one of the biggest memories, is sitting around with family, talking with them, getting to know who they are. And that is time. Time is not playing video games or, you know, going to the mall, but sitting and talking. I think those are my big memories. In terms of the land, I think what I noticed about the land then, and continue to notice when I go back, is the disparity in the land. I come from a family who does very well in Haiti, and the grounds that we live on are, you know, relatively large, and have gates around them. And when you go through the city, there are people who have no land at all, who are fighting over tiny patches of green, and whose homes look very, very different than the ones that we lived in. And so I think we remember very clearly there was a big difference between the land that some people live on and the land that others live on.
From an early age, you were conscious of the disparity?
From a very early age. And my mother tells stories all the time about it, from things I can't even remember, how it would upset me as a child, some of the disparities.
How and when did you get particularly interested in the homeless as a disparity in terms of the fact that homeless were so pervasive in Miami, but I guess I'm even thinking even before Miami when you moved here.
So I've been very interested in the idea of poverty and ending poverty for as long as I can remember. I think ending poverty in a global sense, in a big sense, is the challenge of humanity, is that there's enough resources in the world to feed a certain number of people and house a certain number of people. I mean, there's questions about whether or not we're going over that amount of number of people. But certainly right now, with the amount of food that's produced and thrown away in the wealthier countries, that's enough to feed people in the poor countries. So ending poverty, I think, has been big for me. For homelessness itself has obviously been an issue, is a big issue, and is the biggest demonstration of poverty. But the reality is, we say this all the time, and we Take Back the Land is not a homeless organization. It's a Black community organization, and we're looking to empower the Black community. So we're not dealing with homelessness per se, but homelessness is a function of a lack of power in the Black community.
Did you have, as you were growing up, did you have any models of activists or advocates, in one sense, or political insurgents that you read about that particularly moved you?
So obviously, I was taught about Martin Luther King and the traditional civil rights leaders, and that served as my model for many, many years. When I finally went to college, I didn't recognize how sheltered of a life I lived until I got to college, when all of a sudden I was exposed to all these other people, and in particular Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, and some other figures like that. And so those became kind of like the new models starting out in college. And I remember reading my first pamphlet of Malcolm X speeches, And I was just shocked and appalled at some of the things he was saying about the inherent racism, not just racism, but inherent racism in the United States, about the global system of inequality and how some people are poor, are rich as a result, not casually or coincidentally, but are poor, are rich as a result of the poverty of so many people in the world. That they directly become rich because of that. It was extremely shocking. It was very upsetting. And it's not something that I've ever heard before. In fact, went against the ideas that I had about the way human beings can and should and were capable of relating to each other.
How do you resonate to the word radical? In other words, do you assume that your own thinking is radical or not? And I'm just curious, because as you well know, the word is going to the root of things. So I'm just curious, because I've pondered that myself in different ways, because I think there's oftentimes a convergence between radical and something else.
So let me just say, I want to say I'm not oblivious to the difference between some of the things that I say and do, or Take Back the Land says and does or thinks of, and how that relates to the rest of the world, and therefore why it can legitimately be called radical, because there's a big difference between what we do and what other people might do, and therefore that is, I guess it's a definition of radical. But to be honest with you, in a more objective sense, I don't think the idea that human beings should live in a house is radical at all. I don't think the idea that human beings should get to eat every night and every morning is a particularly radical idea.
Okay. Perhaps, and we're going to hold questions for maybe another half hour or something like that, and then open them up to questions. But perhaps what you could do is tell us about what you could see of the organizations in the Miami area and their effectiveness or ineffectiveness when you came into the scene, and then we can get to Illusia Village and how its place became central to your life.
Well, I think something that you don't see about Miami right away, you have to learn about it, is that the Miami does not have a long history of building organizations. The civil rights movement never really dipped all the way down to South Florida. So there's not this history of years and years of community organizing and things. And of course, there was great work that was done in Miami, but the civil rights movement itself never really came down this far. So you go to other cities and they have histories of years and years of long struggle, of fighting, of organizing communities, which just doesn't exist here. There's not that community memory of what it is to build an organization, what it is to build a social justice movement.
Why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it is geography. It's just that it's far down and there's nothing else near it. I mean, it's far down also in many parts of Texas, but because it's closer to geographically to some other areas. But particularly at the time, to drive all the way down to Florida, down to South Florida, in order to be involved in some direct action meant something different than being in North Florida or in Atlanta or in other places. So I think geography, was a victim of geography. And of course, the other factor is that you have so many people coming from so many different parts of the world into South Florida, and those people bring their collective memories and the memories of their societies, which don't necessarily match those of here, and then you have a very different thing. I think what I noticed right away here was the level of social segregation that existed in Miami. And it's extremely fascinating, I guess from a sociological point of view, but very frustrating from an organizing point of view. So when I grew up in Washington, D.C., we really had black people and white people, and then you had a growing Latino community. In Miami, not only do you have black, white, and Latino, but in entirely different proportions of what you had in Washington, D.C. But inside the black community of African American, Haitian, English-speaking Caribbean, Jamaican, Trinidadian, etc. Continental African, and Afro-Latino, which is very different than Latino. Then inside the Latino community, I'm saying that now, but most people in Miami, when you say Latino, you mean people who speak Spanish, but who were not born in Cuba. So you have Latino and Cuban, and then of course in the Latino communities, and it's split up among many different countries as well. And then you always have